Hey, what is up guys? It's Brendan here, and today we're going to be talking about when it makes sense to apply for a private student loan, right? What is the best time, and when does it actually make sense for you to go for a private student loan when maybe you've already taken a look at federal student loans and you're looking for additional funding for your education? That's what we're going to be diving into here in today's video, again, going over when it actually does make sense to apply for and go for a private student loan. Now, before we dive into things, of course, I do want to mention, if you do want to check the current rates on private student loans, you can go and check out that first link down below in the video description. That's brendanvalesky.com/best student loans. That will take you right over to this page here where you can compare the top student loan lenders for you today. And it is dependent on your zip code as well. So no matter where you're located, you can enter that in and get the list of the top student loan lenders and providers and companies for you. Again, College Ave is our #1 choice here on the channel, and they are listed at the top of this list, done in partnership with money.com. Now, again, the link to this page is that first link down below in the video description. And without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the topic for today's video. Now, of course, not every single person necessarily needs a private student loan, but in certain cases, it can actually make sense in order to bridge the gap between the federal student loans, scholarships, and other funding options. Now, when it comes to the actual cost of college and, why people are even looking for student loans in the first place, right? It's no surprise that, college tuition has increased year after year. It averages almost $40,000 per year, which can make it difficult for some students and families, and really for many, to pay out of pocket. So it does make sense to look into different options for paying for higher education, such as grants, scholarships, as well as federal student loans. Now, there are certain cases where private student loans can also help cover substantial prices and costs that may come with college, right? But this type of loan, the private student loan, does only make sense in certain circumstances if the other funding options aren't already covering your needs, which, especially with the rising costs of higher education, has become so expensive nowadays. A lot of people are turning to private student loans to help bridge that gap there. Now, when does it actually make sense to apply for a private student loan for your education? So here we're going to go through a couple of different scenarios and examples for you in this video here today. And kicking the list off here is, of course, first and foremost, when you've exhausted your federal student loan options, right? Federal student loans are usually the best favorable terms in terms of the actual interest rate that you're going to have. It is the best borrowing option, typically due to the lower interest rates. They have flexible repayment plans, and they have certain borrower protections, as well as the fact that, not necessarily everybody needs a cosigner with the federal student loans, which can also save you a little bit, maybe if you are in a more independent scenario, right? If you don't necessarily have as easy of access to someone who's willing to be a co-signer for you on loans. That is going to typically be the best way to get a lower interest rate, but with federal student loans, they do have more flexible options in that case. Now, in the case where you may need a private student loan, of course, is if you've maximized these federal loan options for your academic year, but you still need the additional funding, then the private student loans might be worth considering for you in that case. And if you have a decent credit profile or an income, maybe if you're already a little bit more established, maybe you've been working for a little bit, maybe you've already got your first credit card, maybe you've kind of started down that path of starting to build your own credit, then you might actually be in a better position than you may think, right? Or if you can find a good cosigner, if you have a good cosigner, that can also help you in this scenario where you still might be able to get a private student loan with a decent interest rate and comparable to what you would maybe expect with federal student loans as well. So again, that's the first case scenario. Now, the second situation is when you don't qualify for federal student loans. Now, believe it or not, not necessarily everybody actually does qualify for federal student loans. You may hear that on the internet, federal student loans, but in some cases, not necessarily everybody qualifies, right? So federal student loans, they don't require a credit check or cosigner in most cases. So, it makes it more accessible to a wider variety of students. However, there are cases where you may be ineligible for federal loans due to the certain circumstances, such as immigration status, or limitations due to parents' incomes, right? If your parents' incomes are too high, then you also might not qualify in that case as well. Or if you're a international student as well. So maybe if you're an international student on a visa, you may also not qualify for federal student loans depending on your situation. So that's something else to consider as well. Moving on, next in this list, at number 3, we have is after you've taken advantage of grants and scholarship opportunities, right? Of course, first and foremost, you want to take advantage of that free money that you can get. But if you've already exhausted all the free money that you have available to you for your education, then, you can also look into as well as your federal student loans, you've already exhausted that, right? You can look into applying for a private student loan in order to combine the grants, scholarships, and loans can, give you better overall financial situation for securing your academic pursuits in your college education, right? Another situation here is if you have a funding gap, right? I've kind of hinted at that already and kind of touched on that point. But even with certain, financial planning, you've set up your monthly budget, you still might have a gap between what your overall costs are. And that's where private student loans can have higher borrowing limits and allow you to fill that funding gap. When in terms of how much money you actually need, it is important also to consider you don't need to take on unnecessary debt. So make sure that this funding gap is calculated to actually how much you really do need instead of taking on unnecessary debt that you would have to then repay in the future. Another big one, obviously, is when you need to cover other college-related expenses, right? So tuition and fees are just part of the college expense. You also have things like housing, right? Housing and where you're living is a big one. Meals, transportation, personal supplies, textbooks, all those kind of things do quickly start to add up and are bigger expenses that then are going to be part of college, right? So in some cases, in a lot of cases too, grants and scholarships are only available for tuition costs, so they don't actually cover other expenses. I know some of you guys may be living at home. That's one way to cut on the housing costs, but ultimately you may still have meals on campus. Textbooks are honestly something you really can't get away from, with some professors, of course, unfortunately. But that's one extra cost you also have to consider as well. So a lot of these kind of extra expenses are also things, especially if you're living away from home, obviously that housing cost, meal cost, transportation, getting to and from school, all those kind of things. I know a lot of colleges do have like easy local transportation, like different bus systems, and so you can save a little bit of money there. But ultimately, your housing and food costs are going to be something that is essentially you're unable to avoid completely. Again, like I said, unless you're living at home. And that's another thing that private student loans can also help you cover the cost of, kind of bridge that gap there as well. So, at the end of the day, ultimately, private student loans can be a good option in certain cases, but should only typically, be considered once you've exhausted other funding options. Obviously, it makes sense to consider federal student loans before private loans because of the lower interest rates and borrower protections and things like that. But if you do want to consider private student loans and take a look at the different terms and interest rates that are available, again, I do want to remind you can go to that first link down below in the video description. That's BrandonValesky.com/best student loans. Take you over to this page here where you can check out the best private student loans available. Again, our #1 lender is College Ave. They do have the best interest rates currently available at the first link down below in the video description. If you want to check out any of the companies mentioned here on this page, you can find the list of the best student loans, right? The best private student loans. So again, guys, I hope you found this video helpful on, again, when it does actually make sense to go for a private student loan. Typically, it's once you've already exhausted all your other options, right? Or maybe if you have additional gaps where, hey, the federal student loans didn't really cover all of your expenses. That's really ultimately where it does make sense for most people to actually go for private student loans, right? Like, if you can cover all the costs with scholarships and grants and other free money, great. Take a look there first. But, in some cases, it does actually make sense to go for and apply for a private student loan. So, guys, I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, then be sure to smash that like button, hit the subscribe button as well, and notification bell so you're notified whenever I upload a new video. Anyway, guys, that's all for today's video, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.